Hello, welcome to my channel. My name is Hannah and let's talk books. So I might be kind of like moving around here because as you can see this weird freaking light beam comes in because of all the light from there. Can't do much about it though, so trying to block it the best I can. But today I've actually been tagged. I didn't really think that would ever happen since there's only like 5 people that watch my videos, but I've been tagged to do the Faces of Horror tag. This was created by Juan at Plagued by Visions. I have not seen any of their videos, so I apologize for that. However, I was tagged by Josh at Coffee, Cats, and King, so check him out if you haven't yet. So the one thing I want to mention before we get into this is just keep in mind that I've only been back into reading for the past year and a half, so I don't exactly have a lot of horror books to choose from, so my choices might not be surprising, and I've definitely talked about all of these before in the past, so there isn't exactly anything new here, but without further ado, here are the questions. Question 1 is a horror story that scared or disturbed you. So before I answer this one, I'd like to preface it by saying books don't scare me, like the written word doesn't scare me. For me, the terror comes from visual horror, so that's why movies are another thing I really enjoy. So these are my picks, and my top one is Scary Stories to Tell in the Dark by Alvin Schwartz, and all those creepy illustrations are by Stephen Gamel. And for me, this is all about the illustrations. I remember reading these stories as a kid. I would check them out all the time from the library. And I have specific memories of certain images to where I would like quickly flip past the page to the next one just because I could not stand looking at them because they freaked me out so much. And I actually found a compilation of a bunch of like the art from those books, and that art style, like, it's just something else. As a little kid, it just really got me, and I'm kind of wondering if maybe that's why body horror tends to be the one thing that I don't like to watch or necessarily read about, because that was kind of what a lot of these artworks were of, and like to this day that's something that just still gets me in terms of horror. Also in this category would be Uzumaki by Junji Ito. This is his work that's just all about spirals, and some of the imagery here, once again, it has to do with body horror, and so there's some images where it just gets under my skin and like makes my skin crawl, and it's just tough to look at because it just creeps me out so much and actually makes me feel some fear. Next question is a horror story that depressed you or made you cry. I don't think I've ever cried from a horror story before. I can't really imagine myself doing that. I don't cry from books in general. There's only been a few that have done that. So this is for definitely depressed. And my pick for that is Let Me Out, I've Had Enough by Mark Matthews. So this book I actually received as an e-arc off of NetGalley a while back, and it's definitely out by now. And this one, you have to be in the correct headspace to read. Like, all the stories are very, very dark and depressing, and they kind of, I don't want to say glorify suicide, but it's definitely talked about and everything. It's just one of those things where you read it and it's just like, why did I do that? I did give this 4 stars, so I mean, I must have really enjoyed it, but like my memories of it now is just like depressing. So definitely don't recommend reading this if you are kind of in a dark place right now or going through a tough time mentally. But this was definitely the first thing that came to mind when I read this question, because just like, even if you just look at all the reviews, everyone is saying like, don't read this if you're depressed, don't read this if you're not in the right headspace. So this is definitely one of the darker books I've read. Next is a horror story that made you laugh. I'm usually not into horror comedy, like I really just kind of have to be in the mood for it. However, my top choice for this is Bunny, I don't know why I'm saying Mona Awad And this one got pretty popular just for how bizarre it is, and that really holds true. There are some laugh out loud moments here just by the pure ridiculousness of it. It's just, it makes no sense, and it's like, why is this going on? Like, what is happening here? These girls are crazy. Like, it's a good time. It's bizarre. It's might not know exactly what's happening, but it's definitely worth the read. And secondly, I would also say Little Bird by Tiffany. I'm not sure if her last name is Mure or Moretz. I'm trying to pronounce it the French way, apparently. So either or. But this was another one that I had received as an ARC. And the humor here is in that the main character is very, like, self-deprecating. She definitely is not a fan of herself at the moment. She's kind of at a low point in her life. And there's this skeleton that pops up in her backyard. And so they're just kind of, like, quipping at each other back and forth because she just wants to be left alone. And the skeleton's just like, my name is Skelly and I'm not going anywhere. So it's just another story where it's kind of ridiculous, but it does get more serious later on. And I also had rated it 4 stars, I believe, just because it was fun, light in the humor way, I guess, read that I ended up really enjoying, and is definitely more on the humorous side than like the horror dark side. All right, 4th question is a horror story that made you angry. So my top one here, and I gotta make sure you understand this. This is for the graphic novel version of Hell House by Richard Matheson, and I just lost my place. Simon Fraser. So this was like a collaboration with them to do the graphic novel. I have not read the book. Graphic novel comes after the book. It's supposed to be based on the book. It's literally called Richard Matheson's Hell House is the full title of it. And this made me angry. So essentially this entire graphic novel, besides the pacing being fucking weird and rushing the ending, there's basically this one female, and she's not even the only female character in this, but she is like very, very targeted for some reason. Pretty much the entire graphic novel is just her getting assaulted, like sexually assaulted by the living, the dead, just fucking everything. And I just couldn't really get past that. Like, it's just so often, it's so much. It's like gratuitous, I guess, is how I would describe it. And I don't know if the book is like that, if it's as often in the book, or if that's like a main theme of the book, but like this poor woman just could not get a break. Like, she was just constantly being bombarded, and that's pretty much like the only thing that happened in the graphic novel. So that ended up not being for me, not my taste. And after hearing so much hype about the book, reading that graphic novel just completely disappointed me, and was like, really? Because my library happened to have the graphic novel, they don't have the actual book, so that's why I read this first. But now I'm just like, do I even want to read the book? Is it just gonna be more of the same? I don't really want to read about this woman being sexually assaulted a million fucking times. So I don't know, you tell me, is that the only thing in the book or not? Another horror story that made me a bit angry is My Heart is a Chainsaw by Stephen Graham Jones. This is a pretty new release. I bought this the second it came out. I think I had it pre-ordered actually, and that was a disappointment. So what made me angry here is that the main character is kind of like obsessed with making her life be a slasher movie, and she thinks she's starting to see signs around town that point that things are going in that direction. So then she starts doing things on purpose to try and like push that narrative and create that scenario. But she literally like destroys evidence to do this that would have like helped solve a murder and stuff. And so when that scene's like playing out, I'm literally just like, are you fucking kidding me right now? Like, are you this stupid? Like, I just could not stand how she was acting just so she could play out this fantasy of being in like a slasher movie. So that is another one that ended up being super disappointing for me. And I also have a third pick in this category, which is We Have Always Lived in the Castle by Shirley Jackson. This doesn't really have anything to do with the book itself, but what made me angry is that this book was pitched to me as a ghost story. Like, I was straight up told this was a ghost story, and that's why I picked it up, because I had read The Haunting of Hill House by Shirley Jackson, and loved some aspects of that. So I thought I was going to get more of that in this. And that is not the case. This is not a freaking ghost story. So please do not tell people it is such, because it might upset them a bit when they find out it is not. Question 5 is a horror story that is important to you. So my top pick for this one, 100%, is Pet Sematary by Stephen King. And that is because this is the story that got me back into reading. This is what kind of motivated me to start this channel and pick up horror again and books in general. I think this was a 5-star read for me. Like, I don't think I'm mistaken. I absolutely love the book Pet Sematary. I loved the movie before I even read the book. The one from the 80s, I believe it is. I've seen that a million times. And it's just always a story that I think is just so well done, and like the lore behind it and everything is so interesting. So this one will always be close to my heart. I don't own a physical copy of it, so that's definitely something I would like to have someday, just because that holds so many memories for me and is just basically the starting point of how my reading journey has been this past year and a half. And something is in my eye, of course. Second in this category, we have another newer release with All's Well by Mona Awad. Yes, she is appearing in this tag twice. So this book, the main character actually deals with fibromyalgia, which, as I mentioned a million times, I have as well. And this book ended up being a bit disappointing for fans of the author, but for me, I could connect to the character so well that this was another 5-star read for me from her, and she is now a must-read author for me as well. Just the fact that the main character has fibro and it's a horror story, like, hell yeah, sign me up. Of course I'm gonna want to read that. So that's why that one is important to me as well, just because of how much I could connect with the character. And we're to our last question, actually, and that is a non-horror story that you consider horror. I actually read this super recently, and I think that's probably why this popped into my head right away. But that is The Mad Women's Ball by Victoria Ma, and I almost completely mispronounced every word there. This book is actually billed as historical fiction, and I'm really surprised that the horror category is not mentioned at all here, because this takes place in the Salpêtrière Asylum in Paris. This place still exists today, although today it's just a regular hospital, and it's also a teaching hospital and stuff. But the story takes place in like 1885, I think it is, when it was still an asylum. There are characters in this book who actually existed, like Professor Charcot. There are patients mentioned in this book that actually existed, but it talks about what happened to these patients, what was done to them. There are some very, very disturbing things. And honestly, I think it's a bit difficult to tell a story that takes place in an asylum without it being considered horror, without it dabbling in the horror genre, just because of the history of what happened in these places and how poorly people were treated. That is a horror story. Granted, it's a true one. So this was one where I'm just surprised that no one really talks about it being in the horror genre and how it's not labeled as such. And the second book for this category I want to talk about is The Fate of Stars by S.D. Simper. This is a freaking romance book of all things, but this is one where that whole beginning was not what I expected and is not something that you would see in a romance book. I'm going to read what my content warnings are for this book. So in my original review, right at the top, I put content warning: torture, kidnapping, sexual assault, self-harm, slavery, and infertility. And I also should probably add mutilation to that, because I reread my review and I talk about that further down, and it's just kind of like, my god, how is that not a horror story? The beginning of this pretty much starts with this female pirate kidnapping this mermaid from the water. Like, she's forcibly taken from the water. She's put in what's essentially like a fish tank for herself. She's starved, she's tortured, she's mutilated. Like, all these horrible things happen to her in the beginning, and it's like, how the hell? Like, the description of them like mutilating her mermaid tail and stuff, like, it goes into detail, and it's just like, what? Like, it's some fucked up stuff. And that's why I think this should be labeled a horror story, regardless of the rest of the content in the book, or if it's supposed to be a romance story or what. I finished it, and it's actually a decent story. Like, it's one of those where I'm like, is it bad I want to continue with the series? But just that whole beginning, like, you cannot tell me that's not horror. And that is all. That's all the questions for today. I hope maybe that gave you little recommendations, even though I've talked about these before. Yeah, thank you for hanging out with me. As always, it is very appreciated. And until next time, bonne journée and au revoir.